Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the keynote address of the 2013 Government Buying For Conference. And thank you, everyone, for coming out on such a beautiful afternoon. I know if this wasn't happening right now, I'd be outside because it's been pretty terrible all week right now. So thanks for coming out. First things first, I'd like to thank the Issues Committee and Central Program Council for sponsoring the talk tonight. I'd also like to thank our fantastic crew at the Roosevelt Institute, UT chapter, for making this happen, especially Julia for making things fall in place when they needed to. And thank you, Alan Smith, who's out in the Rotunda, for coming all the way down. He's from the main Roosevelt office headquarters. So we were blessed to have him. We've had a wonderful set of presentations today, for those of you who haven't been able to make it for the rest of the conference that was going on today. From students, from academics, and I'm extremely excited to cap the day with an address from one of the most capable and well-respected political economists alive today, really. Alperovitz has had a distinguished career as a historian, political economist, activist, and government official. Currently, he is the Lionel R. Bonham Professor of Political Economy at the University of Maryland. He is a former fellow of King's College, Cambridge University, Harvard's Institute of Politics, the Institute for Policy Studies, and a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution. He is also the president of the National Center for Economic and Security Alternatives and is a founding principal of the University of Maryland-based Democracy Collaborative, a research institution developing practical, policy-focused, and systematic paths toward ecologically sustainable, community-oriented change and the democratization of wealth. There we go. He has authored many books, including America Beyond Capitalism, my favorite title, personally, Unjust Deserts, and his new book, What Then Must We Do? Straight Talk About the Next American Revolution. This conference was hosted by the Roosevelt Institute, like I mentioned, and I couldn't think of a more apt individual for tonight's keynote than Dr. Alperovitz, because his career and his approach to these public issues very much reflects what I think the Roosevelt Institute is striving to do. So in academia these days, we talk often about the idea or about true social justice. Well, at least in some parts of academia, we talk about social justice. And we dream big when it comes to these issues often. And then in mainstream politics, we're sort of infatuated with the practical and with political reality, all while leaving any sense of dreaming big out of the picture. And in our mainstream political dialogue, we talk very little about making big, systematic, structural changes to our political system, often to, I think, our detriment. And as we regrettably know, rarely do academia, or at least pockets of academia, and practical politics communicate in a real meaningful way. Dr. Alperovitz's work and career demonstrates, I think, a genuine attempt to bridge this divide, to dream big about structural and systematic changes in politics that make these changes happen, while actually striving to make these changes happen on a practical level. Dr. Alperovitz is an academic who has spent his life's career seeking real change on a policy level and attempting to adapt our communities in a way that actually reflects our values. And what's more, he's done more than just seek change, he's actually seen some results. So without further ado, Dr. Alperovitz.
Thank you for that more than generous introduction. I'm really pleased to be here with you all and to see my old friend John Stewart and Nancy Stewart from way back when. I'll tell you when in a moment, so thanks for coming out. I read the student newspaper, and it said that I'd been invited because I come up with unusual ideas or interesting new thoughts about what could be done politically, something like that. And so I was pleased to see that idea. But I also want to start this conversation by saying, as John and Nancy know, I've spent a good part of my life in what is called hard-nosed, down-dirty politics. I was a legislative director in the House of Representatives. I was a legislative director in the United States Senate. I did policy planning in the United States State Department for UN matters. Been there, done that, know about that. So I'm going to offer you some, what I think are interesting and perhaps slightly progressive notions of where we might go. But I want you to, sit while you're sitting there, think about this. I'm talking to you about some things that I think have a political reality, perhaps slightly different from the reality that you see in the newspaper and the kind of conventional discussions of politics. A reality that I think has power behind the ideas that are coming. So just bear that in mind as we talk about some of the new things that are going on. So a place to start. One place to start is most political economic systems, self-evidently, have a great deal to do with who controls wealth and who controls power. In most systems, wealth is deeply correlated with power. So that, for instance, in feudalism, the people who had the land, mainly the lords and the church primarily, had the power. Not entirely, lots of variation, but that's the starting place. In 19th century small business competitive capitalism, the kind that Milton Friedman used to write about, there were small business people who set the terms of reference for the larger system. Most of these small business people were farmers. They were farmer business people operating as capitalists, small business people, as opposed to peasant farmers in Europe, who were operating in a much different structure. And that was competitive capitalism through the 19th century, the Jacksonian era, etc. And largely the politics of that era, including its export policy, reflected that. We could go into these all too generalizations, but I want to set up a different part of the argument. In state socialism or communism, the state had the wealth, and the power was concentrated in the state. In corporate capitalism, and it comes in different flavors, largely speaking, the giant corporations and the people who own them have most of the power. Now, the variations on that theme are pure corporate capitalism, like the end of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, when giant corporations generally ruled Washington, to the period from about 1934-35 to about 1972, when there was substantial balancing of that power, called liberalism, or in Europe, social democracy, significantly based on the power of labor unions to make politics work as a kind of what John Kenneth Galbraith used to call countervailing power to the giant system based on who owned the corporations. And then then the third flavor is, corporate capitalism was also the basis of fascism. When everything else declined, that's what the basis of fascism or the kinds of dictatorships in South America were like. So those are beginning ways to ask the question about and to describe all too generally the way systems are organized. And I want to talk about that question because we are in a period where the countervailing power facing corporate capitalism is decaying in its institutional base. Let me say something about that, because we often think about politics and elections. We know that a lot of money comes from corporations. The countervailing source primarily in the United States was labor unions, institutionally. Now, people were involved in movements, electoral politics, and participation, and so forth, but the muscle and the money predominantly came from labor unions, for better or worse. And it was a part of the liberalism that I worked for a liberal senator, for instance. I'm from Wisconsin. I worked for Gaylord Nelson, the founder of Earth Day. That was a liberal senator, an environmentalist, but he couldn't have gotten elected without labor support. And that's part of the general picture. John worked for Hubert Humphrey, and that was the same story in Minnesota. So what happens to a system, I'm going to drop this in your lap, catch. What happens to a system based on giant corporate power when the countervailing base called the union decays? Labor union structure in the United States has gone from the peak in 1954 of 34.5% of the labor force to less than 11% now, to less than 7% in the private sector, and declining.
I believe it becomes totalitarian eventually.
Okay. That's a question. Okay, we have one answer.
Or could.
Or could. So just sit there with that. Because that's the society you all live in, we all live in. And it might go minimally that which gave the muscle behind that particular, another word for you, that particular systemic design, corporate capitalism balanced by countervailing power to achieve liberalism or social democracy, is in decay. Now, I just said a mouthful. That is a very big deal in the history of a system. And we happen to live in that period, I contend, and we can then contend back and forth, because somebody might disagree, I hope, in the audience. But that's a very big deal that sets the terms of reference into which the policy and politics we all live and act upon become real or not real. So now you got a problem, particularly since I read your report, because it's a pretty progressive report. And it does depend upon a power structure that might actually get you there, and that power structure is decaying. Ooh. Do you understand how you get the problem? So, I'm going to let that hang in the air for a minute, and then ask you another question, give you another couple of facts. Concentration of wealth, meaning who owns these entities in the United States, is, now I was corrected on this, because there may be some scholars in the room who will correct me, is literally medieval in structure. Why do I say that? Because the top 400 people, you could easily get them in this room, have more wealth in the United States than the bottom 183 million people taken together. That is a medieval concentration of wealth. That's way off the charts. And the power that attends not only to corporations, but to wealth in politics is associated with that concentration. So now you got a double-barrel problem. The reason I was worried about a medieval scholar in the room is I gave that statistic once, and the medieval scholar came up to me afterward. He said, "No, you're wrong. It was never that concentrated." He was right. He knew the numbers. That is an extreme concentration of power, and it takes its place in politics. So that's one way to begin opening a conversation about what do we want, where we're going to go, and what's this wonderful report, how do we get there. A second place to look at the way to begin to think about this is that, and I would contend if we had more time, largely because of that arrangement of power, that systemic design, there are long-running trends that reflect the outcomes of this particular system as it decays. We'll come back to whether the pendulum will swing. Some people would hope so. Or whether there'll be a crisis which will produce something. But for the moment, what you see is extremely difficult trends. So for instance, the top 1%, as probably most of the people in this room know, have increased their share of income from, over the last 30 years, trend reflecting power, from about 10% of the income over 30 years to about 24% of the income, or 1%. Now, that varies up and down depending upon which year you look at it. Some years it's 22, some years 23, 21, but it's in the 24% range. Take that as a starting number. Meanwhile, the rest of the society has received virtually no change in the distribution of income. Virtually no change. Marginal change for median wages, very fractional, over 30 years. That is a powerful long-term trend reflecting deep structural power in the political economic system. You want to think about it another way. Virtually all of the gains of the political economic system, just look at this one, because it's kind of, people say this on television. Put it in your lap and look at it. Virtually all of the gains of the political economic system in this period have gone to the top 1% of the system. What happens when a system generates outcomes in which virtually all of the gains go to the tiny group at the top? And you live in that system along with me. So that reflects some of the power relationships we're talking about. On other relationships, poverty's gotten worse. That the percentage increase in poverty since the early 90s is worse than it was in the 1960s. And if you measured poverty by any statistical measure other than the foolish one we use, you guys know how to measure politics? You know Molly Orshansky? No? The poverty number was created by a government bureaucrat named Molly Orshansky in the 1950s, and she said, let me take the amount of food that an average poor family eats and we'll multiply it by 3, and that's poverty. That's literally what happened. And we've been living with that definition. So when they say this many people in poverty, that's what you're working with. In literally every other country, advanced country, the definition of poverty is half of the median income. And by that measure, it's poverty in the United States is twice as great, and black poverty is twice that. So just to get some sense of the system and the systemic trends that we are facing, and the possibility that they reflect deep relationships in the ownership and distribution of wealth. So that's kind of just for openers. At another level, you can say pain is increasing. Social and economic pain. Unemployment, probably by a reasonable measure, rather than the statistics we now use, is probably of the order of 15%. Unemployment just went down, even though employment didn't increase. Now, how did that happen? Well, you all know what happens. The statistic measures people as unemployed only if they register as for unemployment insurance. If they just can't find a job and they give up, then they don't appear in the statistics. So your number, when you hear 7.6% that came out, was it today, this morning, I think? That's a number reflecting the fact that a lot of people have given up hope and don't even register, and don't show up in the statistics. So it's probably around 15 to 16%. And in the black community, usually double, something of that order. The rough numbers, it takes up and down, it changes slightly every year, and so forth. So you're getting pain and no political capacity to resolve trend changes. You do get some changes, and we could talk about, for instance, Obamacare, which has a very interesting exception that proves the rule history. We can do that if you want. But by and large, you can't get trends, and Washington, as the saying goes, Washington is broken. You can't get anything through Congress except cuts. Obama's not going to cut Social Security. He's explicit about it. The centerpiece of liberal politics. And Medicare is going to be cut slowly. So, and you can't get positive change, you can't get climate change through. That reflects the power relationships, all too simply said. And the pain grows, and CO2 increases by 30% over 30 years, and climate change is now a growing problem, etc. So, dire picture. But I want to kind of suggest to you that you're living in a particular moment, we together, in which a particular design, a systemic design called American corporate capitalism balanced by liberalism, or social democracy in Europe, is decaying in its capacity to produce outcome trends of the kind most people affirm, and most people I had dinner with a wonderful group of people who are doing this conference, but most people there were interested in, and the report they wrote would like to achieve. Now, if you're not too depressed, let me put on a different hat. I'm a historian as well as a political economist. I've got these two kind of hats I carry. And so when I look at these numbers and statistics, in fact, I look at it two ways. I'm standing back and saying, what's going to happen historically? We're going to see pain growing, we're going to see something difficulty, the old way's not working. That's very common in history. Lots of societies go through that. Is that the end of history? Is this terribly dismal, boring, decaying, and unpleasant picture I've painted for you, that's it? Or is there a history that might emerge? So that's the second question I want to drop in your lap, because that's what interests me. So just by way of thinking about it, virtually all of the major programs that became the New Deal were incubated out of pain in the state and local so-called laboratories of democracy. So, for instance, what became Social Security, what became the labor laws, what became the health and safety regulations, a lot of that came out of, and I'm from Wisconsin, a lot of it came from Wisconsin, but many states slowly and agonizingly, in periods of great pain at the state and local level, the 1920s were not pretty in many agricultural states and industrial states, the incubation of new ideas occurred out of frustration and pain, and at a later moment, the principles that were developed became the basis, much enlarged, of national programs, the New Deal. Similarly, for those of you who know anything about feminist history, the women's battle for the vote in the 19th century and the early 20th century was a battle state by state by state by state by state, huge and difficult and terrible battle out of great frustration and pain and repression in great difficulty until it became a national achievement. So that's the kind of paradigm, at least to think about as a possible way of thinking about the emerging history into which we are living, maybe. So that's a way of kind of paradigm, maybe. So let's play with that one. I'll let that one sit here kind of in the middle of the room and stew for a minute, and just as a way to think about it. So I've been very interested in what is happening at the state and local level. Remember, I'm a hard-nosed politician who worked in the Senate and the Congress, and I know about that. But I've been very interested in the stuff that's going on at the state and local level out of creativity and pain and novelty, et cetera, that maybe might possibly give us clues to some form of ultimate longer-term transformation. And lo and behold, there's a lot going on. The American press, which is pressed, it has no money, doesn't have money to pay for reporters on the ground. It has been stripped bare by the internet. It doesn't have any interest, and it doesn't have reporters. So you don't know about this stuff. It's almost impossible to find unless you do deep research and paying very close attention, or you've got very odd sources of information. But there is a lot going on, and the particular things that I have been interested in, and I want to suggest to you, may possibly, perhaps, offer some clues to something different, have to do with that question I raised at the outset. Namely, who gets to own the wealth? So if there were to be a democratic system, and if the ownership and control of wealth is one key element, it's not the only one, but if it is central, then maybe it would be true that when we would have to have an institutional base and a systemic design in which wealth was more democratized in its ownership patterns than it is. Kind of dumb, simple logic, right? If wealth is a critical part of how politics gets organized, and if it's very concentrated in this system, then maybe one element, only one, of a more powerful, more progressive politics that could bend the curves and the trends and shift them up rather than down, might require a different institutional, I added this word, institutional way of owning wealth that might undergird and enforce and give power to the next political movement. Maybe. So I've been very interested, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's going on the ground that changes the ownership of wealth out of pain and frustration and difficulty that might give us some suggestions like the laboratories of democracy stuff in the New Deal. So I'm sure you all know or don't know that 130 million Americans are members of co-ops. Co-op. One person, one vote, very American institution that democratizes the ownership of wealth in small scale. Very interesting, because it sits out there. A lot of those people are in credit unions. The credit unions who are one person, one vote ownership of wealth, and very boring American institutions that everybody knows about, but there they are, down-home American. Credit unions have more capital than any one of the big 5 banks. They are not small change, and they're sitting there. So another one, and they're growing. So another one, for instance, let me just say, worker-owned co-ops is a big thing going on around the country right now. All over the country, people are experimenting with worker-owned co-ops and other kinds of co-ops, and we can talk about some of the more interesting examples. I'll give you examples. We're in the middle of a stream of information on this because of the research we do. So we get information almost every day. Somebody's starting a new co-op and a new worker-owned company here and there. And there's an explosion in the last 2-3 years of experimentation. Worker-owned companies in the United States already, worker-owned, Karl Marx, we talked about Karl Marx at dinner, I was very interested in that. Every student at the table had read Karl Marx. A couple of them had read 3 volumes of Karl Marx twice on their own. I didn't know that. We didn't read Karl Marx when I was in college. I lived in Wisconsin with Joe McCarthy. But people are reading Karl Marx. And anyway, the ownership of the means of production is in worker-owned companies is expanding in the United States by leaps and bounds. And I'll give you some really interesting examples because there's a trend line in it. So that's another piece of the puzzle that you ought to look at. Land trusts. Draw a circle around a piece of land, either own it by the city or own it by a nonprofit corporation in order to control gentrification prices or tilt the receipts from land use into subsidizing and cross-subsidizing housing. Did I say that too fast? Because most cities, when you get development, you get land increases, land value increases. And that means the people who live there get thrown out because they can't afford to stay in the housing. So that's usually what happens. Now, one of the answers has been, can we regulate and tax it, or maybe get some of the money back to subsidize housing, and that's politically now becoming more and more difficult. One of the answers that used to be in the 1960s was regarded as weird, is so-called land trust. Now, what is a land trust? It's very simple. You draw a circle around the land in question, you set up a nonprofit corporation or a municipal corporation, you take and own the land by some public socialist entity or nonprofit entity, whatever you want to call it, and then you can control the land gentrification prices. And even if you allow some part of it to go up in value, you can capture the profits and use it for cross-subsidization, but its basic principle is some quasi-public ownership of the value, changing who owns, for a common purpose. Land trusts used to be regarded as kind of an interesting oddity. In the 1960s, there were 2 of them, one in Vermont and one in Georgia. There are hundreds of them all over the country because you can't solve the problem any other way. Irvine, California is doing 5,000 units of housing in land trust. And almost every, Chicago's got 2 big ones. Washington, D.C.'s got a big one. And sometimes they get even more interesting. So for instance, when the government invests in mass transit, subway or mass transit line, at every exit, the land values get very high. Why? Because those are really lots of customers going in and out, so that's a good place to make money if you want to be a real estate guy. And that's the way it has been for many years, that those places, the government puts in a big investment, public investment, down land values goes up, the real estate guys make a lot of money, you try to tax back a little bit if you can, please, thank you. And you can't get much. Not anymore. Many, many, many cities now socialize the land. They call it a land trust. I mean, they just keep it under public ownership so that when the land values go up, the city will lease out the property and capture the profits and put it back in to cross-subsidize the service. That's very common. Most people don't know about it. But that's another illustration of changing who gets to own, in this case, a public authority, municipality. So I can give you more and more examples like this, but we're beginning to see, not by any ideology at all, but out of pain, and out of frustration and out of tax crisis, we're seeing the growth of more and more interest in very down-home, very American transformations of the ownership of wealth in different forms, largely decentralized. And there is an evolutionary capacity in all of this, because it's not just, for instance, little co-ops. There are lots of little co-ops, and they're attempting to do a lot more of them, particularly in rural areas. But in the state of Ohio, let me give you a picture of evolution out of pain. Ohio is a state that now many parts of the United States are beginning to look like, because Ohio has gone through 30 years of deep industrial loss of pain, and it looks like what many states now are beginning to look like. So if you look at the last 30 years of Ohio, and I was involved in Ohio in 1977 for openers. So here's what happened. And if you remember, I'm a historian, so I'm kind of asking you to put on your historian's hat with me. Think about this as a dynamic, evolving possibility rather than as a snapshot, think about it as a rolling movie. So in Ohio, in 1977, a big steel mill, Youngstown Sheet and Tube, was closed on one black September day. In 1977, that was very big news because 5,000 people lost their jobs. Front page of the New York Times, front page of the Washington Post, front page of television. It doesn't happen that way. 5,000 people lose their job every day now, so it's not news. And besides, the newspapers don't cover it. But nonetheless, in 1977, that was huge. And the workers in that town said, what are we going to do? And one guy, Gerald Dickey was his name, said, well, why don't we take over the mill and run it? I mean, it seemed crazy. And then the city religious coalition got together and said, well, why don't we help these guys? So a combination of workers in the city and the ecumenical coalition began to try to organize politics in the state and politics around the country using the National Religious Coalition. And they generated this weird idea that the American workers were going to take over this big steel mill. Ain't it interesting? And we should support them. It's kind of populism, great idea, kind of Ohio workers, and that was the idea. And they're saving their community. It was kind of, you know, goodwill America. It didn't have no left wing, right wing. It was great. The governor, Rhodes of Ohio, very conservative Republican, supported it. By the way, those worker-owned companies have a lot of Republican support. It's not just liberal. It's interesting, including Ronald Reagan. So that's an interesting sidebar I just mentioned to you. And so they got the Carter administration to finance a $200,000 study, which in today's terms is probably a couple million at that point, of the most sophisticated design for how you run a steel mill, and the numbers worked out, and it was done by the best leaders. And then the Carter administration promised, and because all the pressure was on them, $200 million in loan guarantees, and they were off to the races, right? No, not right. After the election in 1978, money went away. Wow, where'd it go? And it is probable, though we cannot prove it, that the big steel companies and the International Steel Workers Union went to Washington and said, we don't want that. I'll come back to this. The union was publicly against it. The international union was publicly against the local workers. First, they didn't want to mess with ownership. We don't like that stuff. We're unions. And secondly, they didn't like these upstarts, because these were activists, and you know, national leadership doesn't like activists because they can somehow make trouble for the National Steelworkers Union. So they were against it publicly, and we think privately. That's 1977. But, and here's, I want to give you this, you know, start at the bottom, build up over time, pre-New Deal, that kind of idea. The people who did that understood that might happen. They weren't stupid. They knew what power was about, but they did a big educational campaign. They said, we're going to use this as an effort to educate everybody about maybe this is an idea whose time should come. So in Ohio, which is a state with great pain, you find many, many worker-owned companies now that grew out of that explosion that failed. And you find centers at the Kent University that help set up worker-owned companies. And you find sophisticated professors who know how to do this stuff, who really know how to do the technical side of this. And you find people who just eventually why not do a worker-owned company. Particularly one way worker-owned companies get created is when somebody retires and they sell it to the workers. And there are big tax benefits now to do that. So, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's why there are now 10,000 worker-owned companies in the United States involving 11 million people, 3 million more than are members of unions in the private sector. In the United States of America, where you live, worker ownership of the means of production is very conventional, and you don't know about it because the press doesn't cover it. But in Ohio, which is interesting, because over the 30-year period, partly because of the pain deepening in that particular state, and partly because activists and people like us, you, me, who else, tried to make something happen, there has been an evolution in sophistication and development and ideas and knowledge. In 1977, you want to get somebody to help you build a worker-owned company, you couldn't find many experts. Today, you can find them all over the country. And that's a historic achievement, by the way. A society that can generate expertise of that kind is a great achievement historically. So in the city of Cleveland, today, on the ground, the city of Cleveland has gone through real pain. It was 900,000. It was headquarters of more Fortune 500 corporations than any other city in the United States in the 1950s. It's now got one left. It's gone from 900,000 to 300,000 approximately in numbers. They got devastated like Detroit. So the pain levels are high. In the neighborhood I'm going to describe for you, 40,000 people, almost entirely black, the unemployment rate is 40%. The average family income is $18,000. That's a poor neighborhood. But in the midst of that neighborhood, there exist, now those of you who are activists, you live in a university, the healthcare, there exist big universities and big hospitals. So the Cleveland Clinic, one of the world's greatest institutions, healthcare lives there. University Hospital and Case Western Reserve University is right in the middle of this community, of about 40,000. that particular design, it happens to be very common around the country. The technical term in the world I live in is called anchor institutions. They are anchored and cannot get up and leave the way big corporations can. So the word people use is these are anchor institutions. And they're in many, many communities. In that particular neighborhood of 40,000, those three institutions, significantly paid for and financed by taxpayer dollars, Medicare, Medicaid, education money, et cetera, in universities and hospitals, purchase every year $3 billion in goods and services, with a B, not an M. Plus salaries, plus construction, just what they buy. None of it from the area. So, you know, light bulb went on. Well, more than the light bulbs, there's a lot of hard work and a lot of organizing, et cetera. But now in that city, building on this history and this knowledge, you will find a complex of worker-owned companies united by a nonprofit corporation, the purpose of which is to build the community, not just make the workers rich, owning partly the worker-owned companies, so they can't get up and go, and the worker-owned companies kicking in profits to the center, and also kicking in money to finance a revolving fund to have more of them, so that there's a complex and partly purchased, using the purchasing power of these anchor institutions to develop a whole different model. Now, what do I mean by that? The model includes, just opened a month ago or 2 months ago, the largest urban greenhouse in the United States, hydroponic. It produces 3 million heads of lettuce a year. 26,000 plantings every single day. It's a very big operation, 3.25 acres. It's not little co-op. It has a large-scale industrial laundry under worker control and worker ownership, and it's the greenest laundry perhaps in the Midwest. It's in a LEED gold building. It uses a third of the water, a third of the heat, and it is owned by the workers in this complex worker community ownership structure and helps service both the hospitals and the universities, but also the nursing homes in the area, which is another purchaser. And there's a solar installation company, which is putting up probably more solar installation than exists in the entire state of Ohio over the next 3 years. So, not your little corner co-op. Quite a sophisticated design with revolving funds and a developing strategy and building out in this community, and using, very American, using what's available here at universities and hospitals. You could